Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for coming today to discuss the very poignant topics of Russia's weaponization of conflict-related sexual violence, torture and deportation. My name is Katerina Busol and I'm moderating the panel today, being a Ukrainian lawyer and also an associate professor at the Kyiv Academy. We're very lucky to have a multifaceted panel today. We are joined online by Ms. Anna Sosonska, who is the head of the Conflict-Related Sexual Violence Unit within the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, which was established specifically just after the full-scale invasion to document and investigate and prosecute Russia's atrocity crimes in relation to sexual violence. We're further joined by Baroness Arminka Halic, who's a foreign and defense policy specialist and a member of the UK House of Lords. Having found refuge in Britain from the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, she studied at the London School of Economics and has been an advisor for successive Ukraine's shadow foreign minister and defense secretaries. We're further joined by Ms. Emily Prey, who's the director of the gender policy portfolio at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C. And Emily's institute has done an important research on both the patterns of Russia's conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, the avenues for accountability, but also crucially the avenues for reparations and what we can learn from other contexts. And finally, we're also delighted to have Dr. Evelina Ochap, who's a lawyer and a human rights advocate and author. She's a program lawyer with the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute here in London. Our event today consists of two panels, lasting an hour and 15 minutes each, respectively, with 15 minutes break between them. I will start with certain introductory remarks both on the patterns of Russia's conflict-related sexual violence, saying how other atrocity crimes attributable to Russia have a strong gender dimension, and also, again, how we, as the civil society, as legal professionals, as investigators and prosecutors in Ukraine, and as international partners of Ukraine, are trying to ensure that justice for survivors lies not only through courtrooms, not only through accountability, but through individual support for those who have been harmed the most, through enhanced healthcare for survivors, through enhanced psychological support, through couple counseling, and the help of relocation, everything which is encompassed by the term individual reparations and transitional justice. Russia's conflict-related sexual violence, which includes rape, sexual slavery, sexualized torture, threats of rape to detained persons, civilian persons and prisoners of war, as well as to their family members, is well documented not only since 2022, since the full-scale invasion, but indeed since the very beginning of Russia's aggression in 2014 through the occupation of Crimea and armed hostilities in the Donbas area. It's remarkable that Ukraine's domestic human rights NGOs have been documenting these crimes and sending the evidence to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court during the first phase of the war, again, while the investigations and the international awareness was not so high. And exactly because of the lack of this response within the legal domain, within the policy domain to those initial crimes, Russia has amplified the weaponization of conflict-related sexual violence with a full-scale invasion. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has reported that since the full-scale invasion, Russia has perpetrated conflict-related sexual violence against Ukrainian women, men, children and elderly persons aged from 4 to 84. The two main contexts where this type of crime is perpetrated are the occupied territories during the house-to-house searches by the Russian military, as well as in detention. And while women and girls internationally and in Ukraine have been particularly targeted by the Russian military, it's important to stress that also civilian men and POW service persons, servicemen, are also systematically tortured with the infusion of sexual violence by the Russian military. It's also important to stress that the LGBTQI persons are particularly targeted through the weaponization of sexual violence by the Russian service persons. And to conclude my introductory remarks, I would also want to draw your attention through several other points of the UN Commission of Inquiry. First, the Commission has stressed that Russia has been using dehumanizing rhetoric concerning Ukrainians, and it's crucial for understanding that the uses of such rhetorics really amplifies and aggravates the attitude of the military to the civilians, as well as their atrocities. Second, the UN Commission of Inquiry also pointed out that Russia has not borne responsibility for other alleged atrocities perpetrated in Georgia, in Moldova, in Syria during the first phase of the Ukraine war, and that this has emboldened its weaponization of atrocities in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. Finally, it's important to also notice that the UN Commission of Inquiry, as well as numerous human rights NGOs, have noted the very low training from the Russian commanders to their armed forces on the rules and customs of warfare. So essentially, the interviews of Russia's prisoners of war and the reports of Ukrainian civilians and service persons affected by Russia's atrocities prove that Russian military is not really trained to treat humanely civilians and service persons. Providing this context, I am forwarding the floor to the Baroness, and would like to ask you about the UK's positioning on addressing conflict-related sexual violence through accountability and reparations, and also how the UK is helping Ukraine with these particularly atrocious crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for such a good introduction that makes my job easy, in a way, to explain the work that we have done. And I must clarify at the very beginning that I am just a backbencher in the upper house. I'm not in the government, but I've got a two-pronged interest in this. I was born in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which some of you who are a little bit older might, I mean, not very much older, but who are not in your mid-20s, you might remember horrific reports coming out of Bosnia during the 1990s war, where women were kept in rape camps, where men and boys were abused in front of their families, and where children out of rape were born. And some of them, I know, live today across the world, and they're a product of something that wasn't loving, and that was a result of inhumane way in which their mothers were treated. My other interest in this particular issue comes from the fact that in 2010, I was lucky enough to move from the opposition into government and work for William Hague. And in 2012, we started, officially in 2014, something that will become known as Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative. And I can proudly say that that initiative has survived 6 foreign secretaries and 5 prime ministers. And this afternoon, when I leave here, I will have a meeting with the Foreign Office and one of the ministers to discuss how and what we can do to make this initiative be more than it is. And I must say, example of Ukraine is a good one, where Britain has contributed and come out very strongly in order to support our Ukrainian partners and allies and friends in their hour of need. And I was pleased to hear, and I immediately, when the war started, and I also raised it in 2014, but when the invasion started, I asked questions in Parliament, and I approached my colleagues in Foreign Office to ask what support we can offer. Because in those first moments when a country is invaded, it is so messy, people really do not know what is coming their way. And it is really unfortunate and a tragedy of our times that this particular crime has become an essential part of every conflict, and the brutality with which it is committed, whether it is in Ukraine, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Iraq, Kosovo, and even there are reports coming out of Israel that October 7th was also a moment where this particular violence was committed, is something that we should really be concerned about and find the best way in which we can counter it. I am pleased to know that my government has offered a hand of friendship and support to the Ukrainian government at this time, and our Ukrainian friends will be better placed to say whether that was enough or not, but using the protocol that was created in 2014 and translated in Ukrainian language, offering experts and offering what knowledge we've accumulated in order so that you do not have to go through learning process, is something that I would consider to be a success. Now, I want to use this opportunity to say that that, in my books, is not enough. We should always try and do better. And in particular, there is one particular element of this, of the policy that we still are to realize, and that is creation of what I would love to see of international accountability body or a team of experts that would be available for deployment at a short notice and available 24/7 in any situation, anywhere in the world, to be deployed, to be able to advise, help collect evidence, help do the interviews in the way that those who have survived this crime or witnessed it or their families are treated in a way that they do not get re-traumatized, and that we have enough funds to keep this body going so that we don't have to have ad hoc mechanisms like we do it for Myanmar, like we do it for Syria, etc., where between the reports of something that has happened and the interviews and collection of evidence, time has passed to the point that we cannot collect it and make it admissible in courts. I have got some allies, and I'm hoping that my own government is going to really think about it very seriously and potentially create this body on the same principle that Commission on Missing Persons was created in 1996 during the war in Bosnia, which I don't know whether you have come across, but it's extremely effective and good in collecting and matching the remains of those who have perished with their surviving relatives. And at the very beginning, this was very kind of focused on Bosnia, but since then, as the technology has developed and we don't anymore need to wait for months and it doesn't cost millions, but a handful of dollars, we are able to help elsewhere, whether that is in Syria or Iraq or Colombia or Mexico, etc. And I hope that this outfit or this group is going to be able also to help in Ukraine. Anyway, I don't want to keep you too long. I do hope that what we started in 2012 and 2014, Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative, was of use, because the whole point of it was that it would become available so that we can get something that majority of survivors that I have met, and I fully take on board the necessity to support them, to support their families, to ensure that there is a level of reparations, that they can rebuild their lives. But I also think that the basis of rebuilding one's life after a crime of this kind is justice. And if justice has not been served, if those who have been wronged have to live with stigma, if the perpetrators is emboldened by the fact that they do not have to face the court of law, if they do not ever have to accountability, if there is a gap between accountability and they live and sit on the throne of impunity, we will see this crime repeat over and over. I do not think that we will ever come to the point where it's completely eradicated. But if we can create a deterrent by showing that those who have ordered or those who have committed this crime are going to pay the price for it, and those who have been wronged will not be outcast, but will be people who we're going to support and we're going to respect and that we're going to forever want to support, then we have won a pretty big battle. At the moment, and I'm sad to say this, while we were able to help in Ukraine, the fact that it has been repeated, the fact that it took time, the fact that you have to build something from the bottom up shows me that there is a massive gap between what we need to achieve and where we are today. And I really hope that we can together, out of this tragedy and other tragedies around the world, create something that is going to serve as a deterrent so that this crime does not become an essential part that never, ever gets taken to the court, and that impunity becomes the thing of the past and accountability becomes, together with all the other things that we need to do, becomes part and the parcel of staring this crime down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness. Thank you for outlining the whole spectrum of issues of underreporting of sexual violence, of the admissibility of evidence, of the importance of justice, but also of the understanding that justice is layered. And it was actually the Bosnian survivors who engaged with the organization of sexual violence survivors in Ukraine, SEMA Network Ukraine, who were saying that you must go to courts, but you must also pursue reparations, not in 5, in 10 years' time. Mental support, medical support is needed now. So thank you for pointing out those issues. Colleagues, we are now moving to hearing Ms. Anna Sosonska, who is leading, as I mentioned, the special unit within Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. Anna, could you please share with us the insights into your important work, what challenges and what advancements you have seen since your unit was established in early 2022. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you all. Thank you, Katerina. First of all, I want to thank the organizer of this wonderful event for allowing me to be with you online today, to communicate and to share our Ukrainian experience. There is very valuable that all of you, despite various circumstances, continue to support Ukraine and Ukrainians and condemn the aggressive actions of the Russian Federation. To begin with, I will provide you with some simple statistics of conflict-related sexual violence crimes as of 1st of February. So my office has been prosecuting 270 facts of CRSV committing against men, women, children, and also protected persons, POWs. So we have a number of CRSV cases committed against men. There's 97, against women 173, minors, against minors 13 cases, of which 12 are against girls and 1 against boy. There is another type of sexual violence not related to rape, and among which there are such types of conflict-related sexual violence as rape, mutilation, or violence on genitals. Also, we have forced nudity, threats and attempts of rape, forced to watch sexual abuse of beloved ones, and etc. So currently, the larger amount of CRSV was filed in Kherson region, as there is 79 cases, facts of CRSV, in Kyiv region, 53. Also in Donetsk region, 73, in Kharkiv region, 27, in Zaporizhia region, 17 in Chernihiv region 6, and in Luhansk region 3, and in Mykolaiv region 10 facts of CSV, and in Sumy region 2, based on the facts of sexual violence committed on the occupied territories of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv regions. 39 servicemen of the Russian Federation Armed Force were notified of suspicion. Indictment against 24 persons were sent to our national courts, and 2 persons were sentenced to 12 years and 10 years deprivation of liberty. Yeah, you may ask me, Anna, why do you inform us about such a little amount of CRSV? We realize that the number of these cases of sexual violence may be the several times higher than the officially registered ones. Yeah, we realize the fact. When we talk about the cases of sexual violence that have been prosecuted by the Office of the Prosecutor General, it should be understood that these are only those survivors who voluntarily agreed to cooperate with law enforcement agencies based on confidentiality basis. Many are still only considering such possibility. And the extent to which we, as a law enforcement agency, are successful in investigation in these cases will also affect their willingness to cooperate with us. The war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014, and a significant number of territories are still occupied. This is another significant reason why the victims do not officially declare the crimes they experience. They can physically be in the occupied territory from where they can't get out, and where Ukrainian law enforcement agencies or prosecutor office or international humanitarian missions do not have access yet. Therefore, I predict that after each successive wave of counteroffensive and the occupation of Ukrainian territories, we will unfortunately receive many new reports of sexual violence. And also, there are several reasons why victims of different war crimes and CRSV especially don't want to testify before national law enforcement agencies. First of all, I have to say this is difficult to dare to testify officially if you live in an area where aggressive hostilities are still taking place. And a lot of our survivors still live in liberated territories nearby front line. And there is a constant fear the Russian forces, armed forces, may return or otherwise affect the victim or their family in some way. When you are not sure of your safety, you don't think about how to report a crime. You think about how you can survive and help your family to survive. Another reason is stigmatization. Sorry, but I have to say there is a huge stigmatization in our Ukrainian society. For example, most of the victims who have suffered CRSV tell us that they're afraid of condemnation from their community where they live in, and neighbors and even relatives, beloved ones. They're afraid that they will be indirectly blamed for what happened to them, and therefore they don't want to be psychologically traumatized once again and prove to someone the obvious fact that what happened with them didn't happen with the victim's will, but against their will. Ukraine is now gaining such type of experience in working with victims of sexual violence, including children, which no country had before. We have already changed our previous outdated approaches to working with victims to ones that are focused primarily on the victims and their needs. On June 26, 2023, the General Prosecutor Andrei Kostyan approved and officially signed a strategic plan of realization of prosecutors' function in the prosecution of CRSV cases. Introducing these new approaches to protecting the interests of victims and victims, there are adaptation to the personality of victims, respect for the uniqueness of each victim, taking into account their personal identities, characteristic, group affiliation, as well as other factors. prioritizing the safety of victims, their safety, health, and dignity of victims before our other goals, ensuring inclusivity and non-discrimination, zero tolerance for any form of discrimination, avoidance of persecution, marginalization, and perceived lack of personal autonomy or capacity, enabling victims to maintain control over their information, respecting and supporting the victims' right to privacy, control and autonomy in matters relating to their personal history, identity, and image, protecting the confidentiality of any personal information or data of the victim in any form, prohibition of stigmatization, prohibition of transmission and publication of any information about the victims that could lead to actions that accuse, shame, insult, condemn, humiliate, ridicule, or disrespect victims. Currently, the Prosecutor General Office is applying successfully these approaches and has started such work into two pilot regions in the Kharkiv Regional Prosecutor Office and the Kherson Regional Prosecutor Office. We've been working on these new approaches for a year now, a little bit for a year, and they help us to communicate with victims and non-traumatize them. Of course, you may ask me about our goal for forthcoming future and for this year, and I have to say that our goal is to punish everyone who committed these terrible war crimes. As a lawyer, I will tell you, and you probably know it, that proving genocide as a criminal case in court is the most difficult challenge, and that is also the most difficult challenge for us. It's necessary to analyze a huge mass of information, to compile various testimonies, not only about the Series 3, but also about other crimes that the Russian armed forces committed and are committing against Ukrainian. We can already say that the Russians armed forces have chosen the tactic of committing Series 3 against Ukrainian women and children as a method to intimidate and subjugate the population in the occupied territories. But in example of the Kherson and Mykolaiv region, we see how gender-based violence was systematically perpetrated against women, family members of Ukrainian servicemen. This was done to demoralize their husbands, sons, and fathers who are now defending our country, to force Ukrainians to surrender and not to defend themselves. According to Geneva Convention, children and women have special protection during an armed conflict. So the fact that the Russians armed force commit mass crimes, war crimes against this protected category also shows their total disregard for the generally accepted rules of warfare. Even war has its rules, and those who violate them should be subjected to the most severe condemnation, from the level of the simple executor, like a simple soldier, Russian soldier, to the highest military and political leaders who sanction and in one way or another encourage this action. And the last point that I must to highlight the needs of those who have suffered from the sexual violence are absolutely clear. They need medical support, psychological therapy, organization of rest, all that can help them to process the trauma and make their life easier. Also, I have to say that we have a close cooperation with different NGOs who help us to collaborate with our survivors, and our civil society partners help us in this. And that is why I would like to thank them and all of them who help survivors and who carry on doing that. And finally, thank you to each of you who help us to achieve our goal of justice. And I want to encourage all of you to carry on supporting Ukraine, Ukrainians, and our Ukrainian armed forces, because now it depends on them, on our Ukrainian armed forces, whether there will be a bloody Russian trail in modern recent world history. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, dear Anna, for your... Thank thank you very much for your amazing work, because we all know that as soon as the new areas of Ukraine are deoccupied, the people from your office are going there and are trying to be as sensitive as possible, communicating with survivors. And if I may point out, I think 3 key issues from your presentation. First is that people are not numbers, and the fact that the general number of registered conflict-related crimes is more than 100,000, and the registered sexual violence proceedings are a couple of hundreds, does not show that sexual violence is not there. It only shows that it's such a crucially underreported crime, and we need more sensitivity and understanding as lawyers and as people, as you said, the general public, in approaching these survivors. Second, it's great to hear that the Office of the Prosecutor General is partnering with the civil society, because these are not only, in a way, novel and particularly sensitive crimes to Ukraine, they require a very specific and special approach, again, because of the threat of the re-traumatization that survivors of sexual violence can endure in telling their story. And finally, in terms of proceedings, both in Ukraine, I wanted to say that internationally, the submissions to different foreign courts under universal jurisdiction proceedings already concern sexual violence, including in the Kyiv region. So we're hoping to see that the proceedings and the work that you're doing in Ukraine is also supported by investigations and prosecutions and convictions in the courts in other states. Colleagues, we are now are happy to hear the interventions from Emily. And Emily, we would really love to hear from you how the patterns of crimes and the weaponization of sexual violence by Russia since the beginning of its aggression in Ukraine represents the tendencies that you have observed and researched in other contexts, and what Ukraine could learn from the responses from those contexts. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Katerina, and thank you to Chatham House for hosting us here. This is a really great event. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm here because I co-authored a report on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, lessons you can learn from Bosnia. There are copies on the table there. And we saw that there was a gap in when we were researching this a year ago, myself and Tanya Domi and Dr. Kinsey Spears, my co-authors, because generally conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based crimes, they're swept under the rug, as we all have mentioned. These are crimes that aren't paid attention to. They're highly stigmatized. The numbers that Anna was mentioning shows just how difficult it is really to document these crimes and to have survivors come forward. And there are so many lessons that we can learn from other contexts, especially Bosnia, where sexual violence was used not only as a method of war, but as a method of genocide, so that we can learn lessons from there and hopefully make sure that it doesn't happen again, and that survivors in Ukraine don't have to wait 30 plus years like they are in Bosnia, and where they're still waiting. The majority of survivors are still waiting for any form of justice. Katerina mentioned in her opening remarks that conflict-related sexual violence is widespread in Ukraine. There are instances of sexual violence being perpetrated by Russian-affiliated forces against people of all genders and all ages. Women in particular have faced extensive sexual violence. They've reported being gang raped, having their families forced to watch Russians raping them, being branded by soldiers after their rapes, being held as sexual slaves, and being raped until they are pregnant. All of these act as a deliberate method to subjugate the survivors and further break down societal norms and bonds. It's important to remember, though, when we're talking about CRSV, for anyone who is paying attention to Ukraine, that this conflict started in 2014, and that we shouldn't have been surprised at how sexual violence is being used from the 2022 invasion onwards, because Russian forces and Russian-affiliated forces have been using sexual violence as a method of subjugation, as a method of war, as a method of torture to elicit confessions, and as a punishment since 2014, especially in detention. And we saw this in Bosnia as well. The use of detention from 2014 onwards has been a core feature of acts of sexual violence committed in Ukraine against people of all genders. And actually, it's really important to look at conflicts with a gendered lens, because men were particularly and are particularly at risk of sexual violence in detention centers. within the detention centers, enemy combatants sexually assault and torture men of all ages with weapons like batons, wooden sticks, and pipes. The US State Department has indicated that sexual torture was used to try to elicit confessions, and I'm quoting from a report that beating and electric shock in the genital area, rape, threats of rape, forced nudity, and threats of rape against family members were used as a method of torture and mistreatment to punish, humiliate, or extract confessions. According to the Global Survivors Fund, who did a global reparations study, and they did a report on reparations for survivors of CRSV in Ukraine, that 85% of detainees in eastern Ukraine from 2014 were men. And so when you're looking at the numbers, actually, men were more likely to be victims of sexual violence in detention centers, whereas women were more likely, overwhelmingly, victims of sexual violence at checkpoints and in areas that weren't necessarily safe and with a heightened military presence. And so it's important to keep this in mind when we're thinking about who is a survivor of CRSV, who is being brought to our attention, and not get trapped in our subconscious bias that these crimes are only perpetrated by men against women. And we need to view this conflict holistically, not just from 2022, but from 2014 onwards, and also understand that sexual violence does not just equal rape. Anna mentioned this in her comments as well, where sexual violence is being perpetrated against the wives and family members of Ukrainian service members, because if someone is forced to witness a rape of a loved one, a family member, they are a victim and a survivor of sexual violence. The definition of CRSV expands to include the threats of rape and sexual violence and not just the act itself. And so that even broadens the number of victims and survivors. And just very quickly, when we wrote the report on lessons from Bosnia, where there's an estimated 50,000 women who were raped in the 90s, and that's just women, not including men and boys and people of diverse gender identities. But from there, an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 children were born of wartime sexual violence. And this is also a group that, when we're looking at Ukraine, we need to think about this. If there's rape and sexual violence in war, there will be children born of wartime rape. And you mentioned this as well in your remarks. I know some of the, they're not children, they're adults, they're 29, 30, 31, and they are still fighting for recognition, for rights as survivors and victims of war. So there's a lot of different populations that we need to be thinking about, and not just from 2022, but from 2014 onwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much for outlining that there are other, not necessarily physical forms of sexual violence, such as witnessing sexual violence or facing threats of sexual violence against one's relatives. And oftentimes, the affected persons, the survivors, they don't even understand that this is A, a crime, and B, that it has both a sexual and gender dimension. And that is why we need such a sensitive approach that Anna has been describing, so that we could subtly explain and uncover those levels of trauma. And I think it's also crucial to remember from Emily's presentation that both the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture have said that it appears that Russia's torture infrastructure in the occupied territories of Ukraine is not sporadic, it's well organized. And that, as lawyers, lead us to the qualification of a crime against humanity, of which sexual violence can be a part of and an example. And thank you also very much for emphasizing that we have a lot of male survivors and boy survivors, and they, of course, also need specialized support, both in criminal proceedings, but also through the wider reparations. Emily, I'm sorry. Turning to our final speaker, and speaking also about the fairness of the trials, Evelina, could you please comment on what challenges are there in investigating and prosecuting conflict-related crimes and sexual violence amid the ongoing warfare, and what lessons could Ukraine learn from other contexts that you have worked on? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. And before I answer the question, I wanted just to add to something what my co-panelists mentioned, and Baroness Helik mentioned, of course, the International Commission of Missing People, and they're already active in Ukraine. And indeed, at the end of the year, the assessment of missing people was at least 30,000 already registered. And at the time, also, the government mentioned they have 10,000 bodies still to be identified. So, of course, the technology that the International Commission of Missing People can provide is key to ensure that the families find the missing people, can identify the bodies, and so on. So very important work. And also that they have now a project on conflict-related sexual violence to ensure that they documenters can also deal with the issue and make sure that as they are recording the information on missing people, they also are aware that some of their family members may have been victims or survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, or the missing people are also victims or survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So very, very important element of the work. And then, of course, we mentioned a little bit what the UK has been doing on justice and accountability. And very important project as well that the UK funded was to train some of the judges on prosecuting war crimes. Key, really key, incredible work, but of course we need more of this sort of projects, and there's yet another challenge that I'll mention in a moment. And last but not least, UK has been working at some point on ensuring that victims would be provided with reparations, but at the same time, for example, UK can freeze assets, but there is no way right now to ensure that those assets can be repurposed. There was a very important cross-party amendment last year that was to the economic crime bill. The government supported it and promised to introduce secondary legislation of this sort back in autumn last year. Unfortunately, this has not been done. I'm sure we can table some written parliamentary questions and chase what is happening on the topic. But again, this is how the UK can help in this regard. But unfortunately, there have been some delays there. And there is yet another area of universal jurisdiction and how the principle of universal jurisdiction is introduced in the UK law, and there are certain challenges as well, but I can mention it later on. But in terms of ensuring justice and accountability in Ukraine, what the prosecutor has been doing in terms of collecting evidence, collaborating with other states and organizations to ensure that every individual working in the field is trained. I think there have been definitely incredible proactive approaches. And I'll just mention a few of them. So for example, in relation to monitoring war crime trials in Ukraine, I have been working with, of course, the International Bar Association, the Human Rights Institute, and the Ukraine Bar Association to ensure that the war crime trials are being monitored in Ukraine. And this project started around September last year and throughout the rest of the year. And there were documenters who are watching all the trials proceeding in Ukraine. In preparation for this, of course, we work on a methodology to monitor trials in Ukraine. We've been giving training to the monitors as well to make sure that they can actually go to courts and start monitoring. And generally, there have been a wonderful openness among courts in Ukraine to allow such monitors to enable them to do the monitoring process. There were, of course, some individual cases where such monitors were not allowed in, and there have been some discussions as well how this work can be accommodated. And in relation to this, the report was published last year, the first report, but the monitoring work is ongoing, and indeed it will continue throughout this year. So this is an ongoing work, ongoing project, and we'll continue working with the documenters in Ukraine. In relation to another issue that I wanted to raise is actually in relation to the law in Ukraine. So of course we know that Ukraine has law on war crimes, but at the same time it does not have law on crimes against humanity and genocide. And there have been a very important legislative proposal back in 2021. It actually passed through Parliament. It was meant to be signed by the President, but that's when it stopped. And it included important provisions not only on crimes against humanity and genocide, but also on victim protections, something that yet also requires attention. Unfortunately, it never became law, and there is a alternative proposal going through the parliamentary process right now, and I'm not sure how far it is in the parliamentary process, but nonetheless, from what I've been hearing is that the protections within the new proposed law are not as strong as the previous one from 2021. And the 2021 draft received also a lot of international support from various organizations and international bodies. The new proposal does not have the same kind of support, but nonetheless, I think it's very important to monitor what is happening with those laws, and especially where they could help to ensure justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, whether as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. This is key, and to ensure that Ukraine has also all the tools in the toolkit to address conflict-related sexual violence, and we know that it cannot be done only with war crimes, war crime legislation. And then in relation to something what I already mentioned at the very beginning, in relation to training, I mentioned the training that the UK has been funding for judges in Ukraine, but there have been other trainings that were provided to other actors within the justice system. And for example, the International Bar Association has been working with defense lawyers to provide training as well, to make sure that they're equipped and have all the necessary knowledge and skills to proceed with such trials. And there is also now a training for civil society organizations and journalists, also in relation to the right to a fair trial, and how to engage with war crime trials. And this training will proceed in the next few months. So again, few very, very important initiatives that are out there to ensure that as the Office of the Prosecutor is collecting incredible amount of evidence, and there's a lot of pressure on the judicial system now in Ukraine. Ukraine is provided with the assistance that is needed to be able to proceed with those trials. I would just mention maybe one finding also of the monitoring that we've done. One of the findings was actually because of the pressures on defense lawyers to deal with trials, war crime trials in Ukraine, there have been some delays. So again, this is something that would need to be taken into consideration. We often mention that justice delayed is justice denied. And of course, we need to make sure that victims and survivors are supported throughout the process. Again, that there is legislation to provide them with all the assistance that they need. And that if there is any psychological assistance that they need, also this is provided. And we know, again, that as there are so many victims and survivors in Ukraine, there is definitely a great need to greater access to assistance. And as Ukraine is struggling, of course, with ongoing conflict, access to such assistance will be limited. So yet again, we need to think in terms of what kind of support, practical support, should be provided to Ukraine to ensure that victims and survivors are provided with the assistance that they need to be able to participate in the process. And again, we can talk, for example, about the international protocol that Baroness Helik mentioned, a key document that should guide any kind of documentation process. We can talk about the Murat Code, which was also produced by the UK government in collaboration with victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, including Nadia Murat. These are the two important documents that should guide any kind of documentation process, engagements with victim survivors, ensuring that they are empowered through the process rather than feel that they provided the evidence and they're excluded from the process. So we'll stop here, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Evelina. So many crucial points that the trainings on addressing sexual violence, that they pertain not only to investigators, prosecutors and judges, but also to defense lawyers, because all members of the legal community in Ukraine realize that they want to show the fair judgment on the basis of fact and law, and that includes fair defense. And of course, a lot of also support to the Ukrainian Bar Association and the legal community that, again, understands the role of defense lawyers, including for the Russian accused and prisoners of war in the country. And an important point, I thank you so much for raising it, is that we should also see what Ukraine can do itself, and the reform of the domestic criminal legislation, the introduction of all the statutes on war crimes, the introduction of the statute of crimes against humanity, which is still absent from Ukraine's criminal legislation, is something that the Ukrainian Parliament can and should do now, as well as the ratification of the Rome Statute. And thank you for reminding us about the Murad Code. Nadia Murad, the Yazidi survivor, visited Ukrainian survivors. She was in Bucha, and she again stressed a two-pronged way to ensure accountability, of course through thorough criminal investigations, but also through sensitized, not impeded psychological health care and wider support to survivors. So thank you for pointing out that. Dear colleagues, we have 20 more minutes for the discussion. We would like to take the questions from the audience, and then we will also take the questions from our online audience. We already have somebody's going to help with the mic. Yep, thank you. The gentleman in front. Oh, okay. In front. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Stephen Diel, lifelong Russia watcher. First of all, thank you very much to the organisers for organising this very important, if ghastly, topic, and also for the information you sent out beforehand, which was very useful preparation. I just want to point out one thing which I think is very important about modern Russia is that it has become such a violent society inside Russia. I'll quote two books by Sergei Medvedev, The Return of the Russian Leviathan and A War Made in Russia, which really bring this out. Also, when one of the units, I can't remember the exact number of it, but one of the units, when it pulled out of Bucha, was awarded the Guards title, Gvardia, which of course is an honour. So anyone who thought this might have been just a few rogues, it certainly isn't. It's been organised. But going back to the information that was sent out, I must admit with a certain scepticism, I read the UN report, because it seems to me that over the whole question of Ukraine, the UN has been totally discredited. I mean, how can you have a member of the Security Council, still a member of the Security Council, that invaded its neighbouring country? To my mind, that's pulled the rug out for any authority the UN has. And Baroness, your proposal for this body, I hope you're not suggesting that's going to be in the UN. Can you tell us where it would be?
No. Well, if I may just respond, this wouldn't be in place of the capability that UN has through UN Women and Office of the Special Representative for the UN Secretary General. Neither it would be a replacement for very many NGOs who have done, and civil society groups who have done work for, decades. It would be in addition to. I mean, there is one particular example, if I can just mention, that recently there have been reports of allegations of sexual violence being committed in Israel. The fact that this information was politicized, or appears to have been politicized, has lost amount of time that should have been used to have an investigation or to support Israeli authorities so they can have an investigation. Instead, we have seen, for example, the UN has just dispatched a special rep last Monday, I believe. And because of the tensions between Israel and UN, the very people who should have been supported and the very people who should have been given everything we have to both investigate but also support those who have witnessed and to prove that these allegations are right, we have missed that. And that is why I think you need to have a body, not that it is not a police team that gets dispatched, but it's a body that has all the knowledge and all that we would have collected in Bosnia, in Ukraine, in Colombia, in DRC, etc., under one roof, so that in the times of peace or in the times where they're not deployed, there can be provisions for training of people in different jurisdictions, in different regions, etc. So no, I don't, because that would be a never-ending process of approvals. So I think if it were to be outside, in support of many NGOs and the UN, where UN is, that would be, I think, quite a step forward in addressing this issue.
Colleagues, do you want to add?
Maybe just very briefly, because again, it goes back to the wonderful protocol, international protocol. And so, of course, the international protocol is such a key document, but it's not used across all conflict areas. And for example, in relation to the Murad Code, sometimes people that I talk to, they know more about the Murad Code rather than the international protocol. So I think we definitely need more also education on the international protocol, what it says and how to use it and how to educate the documenters in using it. But the mechanism that Baroness Hellig proposed is also key, because it's one thing to provide training on the international protocol once something happens, but we need to be more proactive, and we need to have those experts who are able to go and into a conflict and start doing the work, rather than just thinking, okay, we have a group of people who should be doing this kind of documenting, but we need to educate them. It's going to take a while as well. The document is over 300 pages from what I remember, so there's a lot of information, and it takes time to train, but we need those experts who are ready to go into a conflict area and start documenting the atrocities the right way.
And if I may add a little bit on the UN Commission of Inquiry, the commissioners, the three of them, they act in their independent expert capacity, and there has been much discussion how the Global South perceives the support for Ukraine, including in the domain of accountability. And one of the commissioners is Colombian, and he was the special rapporteur on transitional justice. So on the one hand, he brings the Global South's perspective and the richness of expertise. On the other hand, he also looks at justice wider, and that is why such big chunks of their report and recommendations concerned reparations and psychological support. Another lawyer on the commission comes from India and specializes in sexual violence, and the third commissioner sat on the media trial of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which I think is also a good indicator for Ukraine, because propaganda and incitement to genocide are such pertinent issues. So the UN Commission inquiry still stands in its expert capacity, and hopefully there is an added value in their diverse perspectives. Colleagues, I'm taking a question online, and then we'll return to the members of the audience for the question. So the question is, how can the media, human rights organizations and independent observers effectively document and report cases of abduction, sexual violence and torture, given the challenges of access to the territory, safety and verification? Who would like to take that question?
Maybe I will just briefly start. And I'm not being paid for advertising the international protocol, but indeed, and this is precisely, this is key, because the document does not only explain the process of documenting, when you actually sit down with victim survivor and collect the information, store it safely. It explains the whole process of doing it, and that includes also preparation, mapping who is doing this work already. One of the issues that was raised by many victims and survivors across various conflicts, and I've been working also with the Yazidi community from Iraq, is that they've been asked the same questions again and again and again by different actors, because the actors didn't know about each other, they were documenting their testimonies, and this is a recipe to re-traumatize the victims and survivors. And this is something that we need to be mindful of, and we need to prevent whenever we even start thinking about documenting conflict-related sexual violence. So there is a lot of planning involved, and also collaboration between those different documenters, making sure that they know exactly who is doing what and where and why as well. We need to always ask ourselves, why are we collecting this information? How it is going to be used? And then, of course, informing, of course, victims and survivors, working with them throughout the process of obtaining informed consent, explaining how this information is going to be used, but also being really mindful of the fact that they were victims or survivors of horrific atrocities. They need assistance. And again, before even sitting down and starting collecting the information, we need to look into best ways how to assist them. And this is actually paramount. This is more important than the process of documenting the information. We need to put the victim survivor first. And this is, again, something that the international protocol is very much equipped to explaining to anyone doing this kind of work. But this document can be used to train anyone wanting to collect information of conflict-related sexual violence. And again, this is the key. 300 pages, not light reading, but nonetheless key to any kind of work in this area.
Thank you very much, dear Evelina, for reminding us about the issue of do no harm. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. I just want to add something. First, I want to thank you for your kind words about the protocol, because that was the major outcome of our conference in 2014. And I'm glad to say that I think it's been translated in 11 or 12 languages now. And you're absolutely right about the way in which evidence is being collected. I know of a particular case of a Rohingya woman who was a survivor of sexual violence, who was interviewed 16 times by 16 different people, meaning that she was re-traumatized 16 times, and eventually when all the evidence was put together, because there were inconsistencies, as they would be because she was asked questions differently in different ways, in different circumstances, etc., the evidence against the perpetrator was not admissible in court. So, you know, interviewing, I wouldn't be able to interview someone who's got, you've got to have the knowledge, the sensitivity, the training, etc., because you're doing with a pretty difficult situation in which someone had found themselves, and also they do not live in a safe and secure environment. They will live either in a refugee camp, or they will live in circumstances that are still unsafe and insecure. And I think I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we always remember that we're dealing with someone who's been traumatized already, who's probably hiding their experience from their family and their community. And in order to interview them, we really need to be doing it in the right way.
Thank you. And just availing of Anna's generous presence with us online, Anna, perhaps you could also add up a little bit on how you cooperate with the civil society, with human rights organizations, and with the journalists to get more awareness about the spread of the trauma in the formerly occupied territories.
Yeah, thank you. From the very start of full-scale invasion, we realized that we should inform our society about what happened with Ukraine and with Ukrainian on occupied territories, to avoid stigma and avoid their stigmatization after the liberation. And I have to say that from the very first stage, we almost failed this mass media campaign, because there were such a lot of information about what this terrible things that happened in Bucha. There was such a lot of information about different CRC cases. And when we started to work with it, we realized that we should work with non-government organizations who have done a lot of work with survivors instead of us, because my division was set up only in September 2022, after almost a half of a year since the full-scale invasion beginning. You know, we lost a lot of time to deal with our civil society. And I would like to say that without our non-government organization who have done their work brilliantly, we wouldn't be able to collaborate with our survivors, because we were trained for the first stage by our NGOs. It was Truth Hounds, it was our permanent partners, Global Rights Compliance, well-known international and Ukrainian non-government organization. They documented a lot of CRSV crimes, and they now help us to document CRSV case and figure out with existing ones on a regular basis. And we received a lot of helps, and we were trained by the Office of the Special Representatives on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict in the UN, Pramila Patin and her team of experts on sexual violence in armed conflict. We received such a lot of information, and we received such a lot of helps. And I have to say that law enforcement agencies in Ukraine afraid of being collaborated with non-government organizations, because, you know, for traditional society, Katerina, you know, because you're also Ukrainian, there's also a controversial point of disclosing information that we are not able to disclose because of confidentiality and because of confidentiality of pretrial investigation. But it helped us when we started to collaborate with non-government organizations, particularly in those organizations who work with survivors on the occupied territories, who work with survivors in Kherson region, in Kharkiv region. They help us with humanitarian aid for these survivors, because I was the head of the field mission organized by the Office of the Prosecutor General, National Police Security Service of Ukraine. And since the liberation of Donetsk region, some territories in Donetsk region and Kherson, my team worked with civilians living in these occupied territories. And for starting collaborating with our civilians, we should provide them like very basic needs. We should cover the very basic needs. When people live just in basement because their houses were destroyed, totally wiped out by Russian armed forces, before starting investigation and before starting interrogation, you should cover the basic need to restore like the documents, personal documents, to provide them humanitarian aid, to provide them medical treatment, etc., etc., etc. And we were not able to cover all this need, but we asked our non-government organization, a lot of them receive funding from you guys, from foreigners, and they helped our survivors living in the occupied territories. And then it was a kind of referral mechanism. Why, when our NGOs helped us to collaborate with survivors, our survivors started to trust us, to believe us as a law enforcement agency with good credibility. So yeah, if you think how to achieve a goal of justice, you should start collaborate with non-government organizations. But as a prosecutor, I must say, you should check their credibility, because there are a lot of different non-government organizations, not the Ukrainian, but a foreign one, who would like to provide only some trainings or just a very basic material support for survivors, and that's all. So we check credibility of our partners from civil society and work only with those who are trustworthy.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for first raising the issue of credibility, that should be a better check both on behalf of the Ukrainian authorities, but also international partners of what projects of the human rights NGOs to support. And thank you so much for showing the shift in mentality in the criminal justice domain, right, about the cooperation with human rights lawyers and NGOs for the benefit of survivors, and not pushing for investigations unless the victims really need that. Colleagues, we have a period for a brief final question, and there was the lady in the second row. Do you still want to ask the question?
Thank you. My name is Olga Lunyova. I am a Ukrainian judge. And I would like to ask, what do you think role of the Commission's report can be in future in holding responsible senior military officials and high-ranking authorities in Russia, taking in account these widespread and systematic war crimes techniques that were used? And especially it's important because Russians have been using those techniques right now while we discussing in this room. On occupied territories is still happening right now. And obviously here it's important to highlight importance of the Office of the Prosecutor General and national judiciary. But if we take a look, our national judgments, and by now it's like around 50 judgments, mostly convicts, they are direct perpetrators or functional perpetrators who physically committed the crimes. And important question, how this report help us internationally make accountable high officials and military high officials?
Thank you very much. So essentially it's a twofold question. First, what is the relevance of the reports like the ones from the UN Commission on Inquiry? And second, how do we ensure accountability not only of those people who rape and torture directly, but of their commanders who give such orders or tolerate such behavior? Colleagues who would like to take the questions?
I can start just very briefly. Just in general, speaking about international legal justice and accountability, it's incredibly important, as Baroness Helic has elaborated on. But also when we're looking at Bosnia as an example, when we look at the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, there were in total 161 individuals accused of crimes of sexual violence, including sexual assault and rape. Ultimately, the court charged 78 individuals, but then only 32 were convicted. So that is 32 individuals convicted of crimes of sexual violence out of hundreds of thousands, countless. We'll never know the full amount. And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Obviously, it's incredibly important, and I appreciate everything that Anna is saying and all of the work that the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine is doing of trying to prosecute every single crime. But in the meantime, just like she said, there are survivors who are living in basements before they're even being contacted with anyone, and we also need to look at interim reparative measures that can help survivors receive the support and some sort of accountability mechanisms they need while we wait for international legal justice mechanisms, because those can be very costly, they can take time, as everyone in this room knows, I'm sure. And so we really need these two efforts to be working in tandem with each other and not just focusing solely on one or the other.
Very briefly, in relation to the Commission of Inquiry, I don't think that it is the role of the Commission of Inquiry and their reporting to actually help with such proceedings. They mostly collect some information, document it, make recommendations for the way forward. But if we look at the work of various commissions of inquiry, it was never really their role to collect the data, collect the evidence, to then aid with proceedings. For example, we've seen the IIIM, some mechanism established very much to collect and preserve the evidence of atrocities, to then help with prosecuting the perpetrators, and they've done incredible work in relation to this. Also UNITAD, a mechanism specifically established to collect, preserve the evidence of the Daesh atrocities. And for example, UNITAD has been working with prosecutors in 14 different countries to ensure prosecutions for international crimes. IIIM has been working with prosecutors in 12 different countries, and again to ensure prosecutions for international crimes. But this is a very different model for those mechanisms, the way they work, the methodology and mandate, of course. So I'm not sure whether that could help, but it can shine a light in terms of the general situation, the atrocities, and guide us as well through the needed responses. And I think that's what the Commission has been doing. But what I would like to see over next months, hopefully not years, is very much an arrest warrant from the ICC that relates to conflict-related sexual violence. We've seen, of course, 2 arrest warrants for the abductions of children. That's a step forward, but ultimately, of course, to see such an arrest warrant for conflict-related sexual violence would be incredible. It would help us as well to focus more on this kind of crimes. Conflict-related sexual crimes are always underreported, under-addressed, and we need to change that. And that could be done, of course, with the help of the ICC, but also domestic prosecutions around the world using the universal jurisdiction. I promise that I will complain a little bit about the UK, about the universal jurisdiction, and I'll do it very, very quickly, within 30 seconds. For example, if you look how the universal jurisdiction works in this country, the law in relation to universal jurisdiction is very limited. Under the International Criminal Court Act from 2001, you cannot prosecute somebody who is not from the UK or not UK citizen or resident. So if a Russian perpetrator was here, we could not prosecute under those provisions. And the UK government refused to change that. We have several proposals, but just I will stop complaining. We need to focus on universal jurisdiction as well, and Germany has been leading in relation to this.
Thank you very much, dear Adelina and colleagues. We will continue this discussion in 15 minutes, focusing on the issues of torture and abduction. But I think the major takeaway from this point is that, from this section, is that whenever any peace proposals come, we should remember that it's not just about forcing Russia out of Ukraine territory. It's not even about the principles of international law. It's really about saving the lives of the people who are in the occupied territories and who are under the direct threat and assaults now, while Russia is still on Ukraine's soil. But to finish the panel on a positive note, I wanted to say that both in essence and in form, I think the panel has demonstrated that both the justice efforts of Ukraine, the reparations, and Ukraine's recovery should have an intrinsic women's voice, and that it will be strong and effective. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Patricia Lewis. I'm the Research Director here at Chatham House and Director of International Security. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this second session on Russia's use of abduction, torture, and sexual violence in war. And this session specifically addresses the treatment of civilians and prisoners in the occupied territories. Very difficult subject to discuss. And we are delighted to welcome everyone in the room and also everyone online who are joining us today in this discussion. This discussion is not under the Chatham House rule. This discussion is a public event, just so that everyone is aware of that. And we are very fortunate in having a panel of real expert speakers for you here today. I'm going to start with Danielle Bell, who is currently in a war zone in Ukraine. And she has served as head of mission for the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and as a representative of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights since August 2023. She leads a large team of human rights professionals. She monitors and publicly reports on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and does all of the things that you'd imagine that she would have to do. It must be one of the most difficult jobs in the world, Danielle. And I know that you're currently in a situation where you might be expecting to have to leave because of air raid. And so I wondered if we might turn to you first to maximize the use of your time in delivering to us, because it may be that you just have to leave in an emergency situation. So if I could turn to you first, Danielle, to kick off proceedings and deliver some thoughts about this issue, what you understand, what you think is most important, how we might address this issue going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, and also thank you to Chatham House for organizing this incredibly important event. And also a warm greeting to everyone in the audience from Kyiv. As Professor Lewis said, I will focus on the treatment of prisoners of war, or POWs, and civilian detainees in the occupied territory, followed by remarks on the specific repressions faced by individuals in occupied territory. My insights today will draw from over 2,200 interviews conducted by my team in both government-controlled and occupied territory since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This also includes 530 interviews with Ukrainian POWs and civilian detainees, both men and women, after they're released and they're back safely inside government-controlled areas of Ukraine. As the previous speakers have mentioned, the torture and ill treatment inflicted upon Ukrainian POWs is widespread. More than 90% of the prisoners of war we interviewed were tortured, often on a daily basis. Testimonies describe a cruelty that's difficult to imagine, including severe beatings, sexual violence, as Anna and Emily explained in the previous panel, prolonged stress positions, which often led to physical disabilities, The violence also led to broken bones, smashed teeth, and in many instances, death. In addition to the physical abuse, POWs have suffered mental anguish and humiliation. Guards deprived them of sleep, exposed them to cold temperatures, coerced them to sing Russian patriotic songs, imitate animals, and act out humiliating scenes. For example, in one of the interviews we did last week, we interviewed a POW who had been forced to stand out naked in the freezing cold and recite a stanza of the Russian national anthem. Appalling detention conditions, including severe food and medical shortages, poor living conditions, and sleep deprivation persisted. For example, last week we interviewed, in another interview last week, we interviewed a POW who had lost half of his body weight, going from 120 kgs to 60 kgs. Civilians detained by the Russian authorities for allegedly resisting occupation face similar treatment to POWs: torture, ill-treatment, sexual violence, and the same dreadful conditions of detention, and with both civilians and POWs, often in multiple instances throughout their detention. Most have no interaction with independent international monitors and minimal, if any, contact with their families. And in many instances, the conditions of detention may have amounted to enforced disappearances, as we've reported in many of our public reports. We all must continue to advocate for the Russian Federation to comply with the provisions of Geneva Conventions concerning detention. I know this session is focused on occupied territory, but I'll quickly comment that the treatment of Russian POWs held by Ukrainian authorities stands in stark contrast. We've conducted separately 335 confidential interviews with Russian POWs, and we observed decent conditions of detention, including regular communication with family members. I'll now turn to a critical yet often overlooked aspect of Russia's war against Ukraine: the specific repressions we've documented in occupied territory. At the outset of the occupation, Russian armed forces carried out widespread arbitrary detention of civilians and used force to squash peaceful protests and restrict free expression. Strict control over residents' movements were imposed, as well as increased surveillance, invasive searches, and the pillage of homes and businesses. Access to independent information by key Ukrainian internet applications was restricted, further isolating residents in occupied territory from their families and Ukrainian systems. Residents of occupied territory live in a situation ridden with fear and anxiety against a backdrop of impunity. Russian authorities unlawfully instituted fundamental changes to society and its governance, which is explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law, which requires the occupying power to respect the existing laws and institutions of the occupied territory to the extent possible. We've also documented countless incidents of intimidation and violence used to coerce members of key public sector professions to cooperate with the occupation administration. They applied Russian law and systems to various spheres of life, such as healthcare, education, justice, elections, media, and administration. For example, residents are compelled to acquire Russian passports and often swear allegiance to the Russian Federation. Without a Russian passport, those living in occupied territory face discrimination in employment, social security, freedom of movement, and access to health care. Moreover, the occupation authorities reinforced Russian identity while suppressing Ukrainian identities. For example, babies born in the occupied territory are issued a Russian birth certificate with their name, with the Russian spelling of their name. Schools in occupied territory must follow the Russian curriculum, using the Russian language and teaching a distorted version of history. Authorities shut down the online Ukrainian curriculum classes, seized Ukrainian books and art, and removed symbols of Ukrainian cultural heritage from public spaces. Children aged 6 to 18 are enlisted in militaristic groups that teach Russian patriotism. In conclusion, as we have documented, the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory carries profound consequences for communities on both sides of the front line. Our collective voices are crucial for keeping attention on Ukraine, including advocacy for accountability for these serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Danielle, thank you so much for laying it out. I think the applause is as much for you, being there and gathering all that amazing information, for all of your team as well. Thank you. I'm going to move straight on now to Dame Melinda Simmons, who was the British ambassador to Ukraine 2019 to 23, and is currently honorary professor at UCL here in London. She's had an extraordinary career working on conflict prevention, resolution, humanitarian response, the National Security Secretariat. She was British ambassador in Kyiv, as I said, and she took up the chair of the G7 Ambassador Support Group, and being absolutely vital from then on in 2020. She led close work with the Ukrainian government to promote reform, strengthen the state, improve transparency, combat corruption, which we're seeing the impact of now, absolutely, and buttress the rule of law. And has worked also really closely with civilian society, non-governmental organizations to help invigorate the rebuilding of Ukraine society for the future. Dame Melinda, welcome. We're really interested in what you have to say about this really difficult issue. And feel free, by all means, to respond to what Danielle has said.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. It's good to be here. I'll try to speak as briefly as possible, but I think I want to make 4 points about the subject, and I want to start just very briefly by zooming out and reminding us all of the obvious. At least I think it's the obvious. I'm not so sure that all journalists are reporting it like it's the obvious, which is that this is a hybrid invasion, a hybrid war, and that the fight on the front line is a huge and a crucial part of that invasion, but it is only one part, and a lot of what we are discussing today forms part of that hybrid attack in an organized way by Russia. So the abduction of children, the rape of principally women and girls, but not just women and girls, the bombing of power stations, the torching of grain fields, these are all part of one strategy that leads to one objective. And that objective is the subjugation of Ukraine. So in that sense, that objective, which Russia continues to push for 2 years nearly into the war, explains a lot about the organized nature of attacks on civilians. The way in which people are targeted is designed, of course, to put pressure on the Ukrainian government by ensuring that people themselves, civilians themselves, feel that pressure and reflect it in the way in which they communicate what they want to happen in their country. And in spite of the fact that polls, every poll that is done, independent poll inside Ukraine in terms of what people feel about their country, shows them extraordinarily, despite tragedy after tragedy, not being inclined to give in, as it were, to that subjugation. Russia continues to do it. There's also quite a big element, I believe, but others may have views who are on the panel, about using this targeting of civilians to set parameters for any level of negotiation that Russia, I think, is probably quite confident it will end up finding itself in with Ukraine at some point in the future, and Putin is waiting for that point. And I think, when we think particularly about the kidnap of children, which I know we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, there is as much a sense of abduction of those thousands of children for, potential future cannon fodder, but can also be seen as hostages for those sorts of negotiations in the future. It's not just prisoners of war who are hostages here, it's also children who had disappeared into camps in Crimea and occupied Ukraine elsewhere, and then potentially form part of the conversation about what can be traded at some point in the future. And that's why I think there are many reasons why children are being kidnapped, but I think that that is one of those reasons and explains why it is highly organised. The UK Embassy was one of those that campaigned vigorously about the abduction of children and the rape of women and girls. And one of the things we did, we were the only embassy that did it, was to hold witness testimony events, and we would bring people in to tell us about what conditions were like. And what we've just heard from Danielle, that bears out what we heard from those survivors from all over the recently liberated or the occupied parts of the country who had managed to get out. But we also talked to children. I think probably among all the experiences that I heard, and they were all, there wasn't a single one that wasn't unbelievably tough to sit and listen to. Listening to those kids tell us what happened to them was probably the most chilling in terms of how organised it was, the conveyor belt. There may have been chaos in some of the administration of it in some parts of the occupied territory, but there's no question that being taken on a bus to one point, met and taken to another camp elsewhere, split from your friends, put together with Russian kids, the humiliations, the beating, the indoctrination, all part of a very experienced and well-worn playbook. So what do we do? Well, I think in the previous panel, I think I heard one of the panelists talk about what the UK had been doing and the UK support for training of judges and support to the ICC, of course, is something I'm proud of. That happened in the time that I was there in Kyiv. It's a really important, and continues to be, a really important part of what we did. And actually the close relationship between our Prosecutor General's office and the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, and that relationship continues as a mentoring as much as thinking about the areas of support that need plugging. That too is, for me, a really good thing that the UK is doing. But if I'm honest, I think probably one of the most important things that all of us need to do, so not just governments, but also civil society and the activists and people who have interest and ways of communicating about all of this, is it's really important to be talking about it. I'm actually quite horrified when I read British coverage, media coverage of the war coming up to the 2-year mark, how much of it is a binary commentary on what's going on the front line, and how ancillary the effect of it on civilians appears to be, particularly in the last 6 months. I find that really odd, particularly coming from analysts who have been talking and writing about hybrid war for years now, that they are not divorceable one from the other. They form part of the whole of aggression. And so it looks as if, as ever, as Christina Lamb said in one of her commentaries in the Sunday Times recently, we're going to have to do what was done in Syria and what was done for Afghanistan and elsewhere, which is keep reminding people that this is how civilians, and particularly women and children, are experiencing this invasion, and keep not letting both the international community off the hook, but also Russia off the hook, and remind them that this too is prosecutable, this too has consequences, and this too is as important for the international community's values and way in which it looks after its own, as is the treatment of prisoners of war and the situation on the front line. Just one other thing then I want to probably finish on, because I think it's very little talked about. We focus so much on what Russia is doing to Ukrainians. You know, women and girls are not lining up to give their testimony about how they have been viciously attacked. The stigma issue remains huge in Ukraine. And for the first 2 years that I was ambassador, before the invasion, we used to give a lot of support, and continue to actually, on domestic violence inside the country, and funded the establishment of quite a few new shelters for women who had experienced domestic violence within marriage. It's really important to remember just how patriarchal a society Ukraine continues to be. And although the war shifts that a bit in terms of women having to take on roles while men are fighting, that sense of traditional views of what marriage is inside Ukraine equally informs women's understanding of what they can say about what happens to them in situations of war. So this isn't, and I don't think people in the international community can sit outside and tell Ukrainian women that if they only tell their story, they'll get justice. There are so many of them that this would take so long anyway to achieve a meaningful justice, but actually it needs to be Ukrainians themselves who are making the conditions right, make their society right for women and girls and others who have been who have been subject to savage attack one way or the other to believe that it is possible to talk about it like it's something that merits conversation. And I'm still not sure that, apart from patchily in some parts of the country, that has yet landed sufficiently. And that is as much about society as it is about leadership inside Ukraine. It needs to come both from the top and from the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. I think we need to go back to that in the further discussion. I'd really like to do that because there's quite a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And it's not the only place that we can think of where this is the case, right? So it's a very big issue. I'm going to turn now to Shahida Tulaganova, who is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker. She directed Ukraine's Stolen Children, and she's an experienced war reporter. She's worked in conflict zones in Syria, Afghanistan, and eastern Ukraine. And her first independent feature film, Exile, talked about the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And her film about the epic battle during the Russian-Ukraine war, Airport Donetsk, won first prize at the Art Doc Festival. And she also produced How to Plan a Revolution, a story of young pro-democracy activists striving for change in a dictatorship in Azerbaijan. And that won all sorts of accolades and awards as well. So we're in amazing hands here. So please, Shahida, if you could give your take on this situation and what you've observed through your work, and how you might respond perhaps to the words of Melinda and also Danielle about how the Ukrainian society and perhaps other societies that you've covered deal with these issues in these terribly difficult situations.
Right. First of all, I would like to agree with Melinda wholeheartedly about the strategic planning of Russian Federation to deport Ukrainian children. There is nothing ad hoc there. Everything was planned in advance, implemented properly, systematically, with precision. And to give you an example, Kherson region, just before Ukrainian counteroffensive in autumn 2022, Russians knew they're going to leave Kherson, so they announced evacuation of children in the pretext of taking them to summer camps. What kind of summer camps and relaxation camp you can have in autumn when you have a school year going? So the kids went there, and a week later, Russians announced evacuation of the whole population of Kherson region. So kids were taken there, thousands of kids, about 3,000, from 3,000 to 6,000 children. So they were taken there, and they were told they're not coming home. So they were blackmailed. They were told that nobody needs them in Ukraine. They were told that everyone is going to abandon them. And despite the fact that the kids were given Russian SIM cards and in many instances phones to communicate with their parents, none of the camp leadership, none of the authorities of the region made any attempt to speak to the relatives, to parents, and saying, hey, your kid is here, are you planning to bring it back home? Instead, what Russians were doing, they were sending these children to foster care in Russian Federation. Why? When these kids have parents. So Russian Federation never facilitated return of any of the children who they took, or kidnapped rather. Now, intimidation of children were horrific. I spoke to one kid called Kostya from Kherson region, and he was so afraid to go back to Ukraine, even when his sister came to bring him, return him, because he was told in Russia that he's a traitor, and in Ukraine he's gonna be killed. So when this poor child, who's 14, approached Ukrainian border guards on Belarusian-Ukrainian border, he couldn't speak. He really thought that this Ukrainian guy is gonna shoot him. And he only relaxed when the Ukrainian soldiers told him, welcome home. The kid was just dumbfounded. To that extent, he really thought he's going to be murdered. So far, only 388 children were returned. And most of the children were returned by the volunteers, in particular Save Ukraine. It's very hard because I was following the story of several children, and many children I'm still in touch with. It takes about from 2 to 4 months to bring the kid back. It costs a lot of money, and the process is not straightforward. Now, when I spoke to Maria Lvova-Belova, the Putin's commissioner for children's rights, she said she had no problem of returning Ukrainian children. Please come and take them. But it's not that easy. Upon arrival to Moscow, to Domodedovo airport, and I experienced it myself, these women are questioned for hours on the way in and on the way out. Like even me, I have nothing to do with the children. I was questioned for 2 hours for whatever reason. So these women face from 7 to 14 hours of questioning upon arrival to Russia. After this exhausting journey from Kherson to Belarus, from Belarus to Poland, from Kherson to Poland, and then to Belarus, and then to Russia, and they're all the way back. It's horrible. Especially when they face humiliation in Russia as well, these poor women. Some of these women never traveled outside Kherson at all. So this is probably where the first journey abroad. And to face this is horrendous. So children come back very traumatized because, first of all, they really felt abandoned. They were in information vacuum. A lot of them never had the chance to communicate with their parents. One story of the child called Sergei, who was snatched again from Kherson region, from one of the villages, by 4 Russian soldiers when his mom wasn't home. And he was taken all the way to Pechory, which is in Leningrad region, I believe. So after the liberation of the village, his mom never knew where to look for the child. He was taken to the orphanage, to the boarding school in Pechory. He told where his mom is. He gave his mom number. Nobody attempted to contact the mom until Russian volunteers traced down the child. They saw him on a database on adoption, Usanovite.ru, which is Russian adoption site. It was written Kherson region. They started tracing down his relatives in Ukraine, and by pure luck, they found the mom. The mom made it and took the kid back. He was all ready to be fostered. He was on the list. He had a family, etc. So she basically took him right on time. Now, when we talk about the numbers, Ukrainian side is saying about 19,500 something children in Russia. Russia, of course, denies. And Maria Lvova-Belova said, well, where are those parents? Because we don't have any applications. Well, excuse me, how would you get any applications? Because we don't know who you got. All these kids from the orphanages, which they took en masse from Kherson region, from Mariupol, and other parts of Ukraine, which they occupied, those kids, the data may be lost. Sometimes the orphanage directors became collaborated with Russians, and they actually gave the kids up. Like it happened in Kherson a couple of times. So we don't know the numbers. I'm sure the Russian Federation has the list, because knowing how Russia operates, everything is actually bureaucratic and systematic. So I will never, ever believe the lie that they don't know where these children are. They know exactly where these children are. They know exactly where their parents are, and they know exactly that they have to return them. But they are not going to, because, as Minister rightly said, they want them to indoctrinate them. They want them to become a cannon to fight against Ukraine. And we saw in 2014, when the war just started, those teenagers, the kids who were in Donetsk and Lugansk, are now grown-up people, and they fight against Ukraine. So that's exactly what's going to happen to these children who are now in Russian Federation. Example, the case of Bogdan Yermokhin, 17-year-old child from Mariupol. He was snatched by Maria Lvova-Belova, the first group of children taken by her to Russia. Before he even reached the age 18, he already received a notification to report to the military commissariat, to be enlisted to fight. What is this? Luckily, the kid is back in Ukraine. There was a horrible story which actually ended up well. But how many children who don't have public exposure, who never been featured on any of the Russian TV reports? That's what we do. We just watch Russian YouTube and look for every single video which features Ukrainian children. But now they stopped doing it because they realize if you see the report, you see the children. So basically, my point is, there needs to be a strategy to help Ukraine to bring these children back, and even more importantly, to rehabilitate these children, because they come back with nothing. They come back with the clothes they wear and nothing else. They need medical help, they need clothes, they need to be educated, they need to be housed. And this is why I think it's extremely important to help Ukrainian volunteers who really work with children and bringing these children back to make it happen, to facilitate and speed up the process.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Arif Abraham, who's a barrister, writer and speaker based at Doughty Street International, specialising in international criminal law, public international law, international human rights law, international arbitration. He's a leading barrister in the Chambers and Partners. His domestic practice also focuses on public war as well as criminal defence, with a special focus on protests. He's the founder of the Accountability Unit, which is an NGO specialising in conflict resolution and justice issues. He's had a number of high-level, high-profile works advising states to create the special tribunal for the crime of aggression committed in Ukraine, along with a number of other very famous barristers, etc. Arif, I won't embarrass you further, and we look forward to what you have to say. And we're hoping you'll help sort out some of this stuff for us from the legal perspective.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Can I begin firstly by thanking Chatham House and New Lines Institute for such an important and timely discussion. I'm going to use the few minutes I have just to highlight 3 points. Firstly, categorize the various harms and really atrocious and egregious harms that we've heard about today, and categorize them as international crimes and consider how they fit into the bigger picture. Second, I'll summarize what the available accountability mechanisms are. And third, I'll identify some of the challenges of bringing perpetrators to justice. So what international crimes are in consideration in respect of the treatment of prisoners of war and the abduction of children? Well, there are myriad international crimes that are categorized in 3 ways. The first, of course, are crimes that we've all heard about, which are war crimes. So these are the violations of the laws of war that give rise to individual criminal responsibility. So in international law, individuals commit crimes, they can be attributed to the state. So among the grave breaches of war crimes, we would think about murder, torture, unlawful confinement, hostage-taking, and in respect of the abducted children, we would be considering unlawful deportation or transfer, in addition to the crimes I've just mentioned. The second category of crimes, which again we likely have heard about but don't know about the detail, are crimes against humanity. So that is where 1 or more of 11 underlying crimes are committed, where the perpetrator directs an attack against the civilian population, and that attack has to be widespread or systematic, and the perpetrator needs to have knowledge of the attack. So as you see, there are lots of quite complicated elements there when it comes to crimes against humanity, but the underlying crimes which would be in consideration would be murder, imprisonment, or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of the fundamental rules of international law, torture, rape and other sexual violence, which we've heard about in the first panel, enforced disappearances, in particular with the children that we've heard about. And in respect of the really horrific mass killings that we've heard about in Bucha, Irpin, Izium, Liman, Kherson, and Mariupol, we would probably be considering also the crime against humanity of extermination. And then in respect of the children, the principal crime we are looking at is the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer. And then finally, the category which is often very difficult to prove is the spectre of genocide, which is often raised in conflict settings. I would say that we are very clearly in the serious risk of genocide territory. I'm often very cautious about using the term genocide because genocide requires a specific intent to destroy in addition to other elements, and I can come into maybe the detail in questions if there are any with that. So what accountability mechanisms are available? So we've heard reference by Dame Melinda to the International Criminal Court, which is seized of jurisdiction of all of these crimes that I've mentioned, and they have jurisdiction since 21 November 2013 because of Ukraine referring itself to the International Criminal Court. That means that where perpetrators of whatever nationality are committing crimes in the territory of Ukraine, where Ukraine itself is unable or unwilling to prosecute those crimes, the International Criminal Court will look at high to mid-level perpetrators. And in March 2022, there was obviously a lot of publicity, quite rightly, by the fact that arrest warrants were issued for President Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, the Commissioner for Children's Rights, for the war crime of unlawful deportation and transfer of children. I'm just conscious of time. There are other mechanisms, of course. Ukraine has mobilized a vast machinery to try and investigate over 110,000 crimes in Ukraine. So that is war crimes that are being taken through the Ukrainian domestic courts, and I can briefly mention the challenges in my next point. And then there's also something called universal jurisdiction. So this is where if a perpetrator is found in a foreign jurisdiction, a foreign domestic court can prosecute a perpetrator even though the crimes were committed in Ukraine. And the UK and other countries have activated that if usually a perpetrator is found within jurisdiction, but there are several limitations of universal jurisdictions, which if anybody has questions, I'm happy to go into. In respect of each of these mechanisms I've mentioned, there are complementary investigations on a vast scale across the world. I don't have much time to go into them, but I'm happy to refer to any that anybody would like to know about. So my third and final point is, what are the likely challenges of bringing perpetrators to justice? Well, apprehension of perpetrators other than what we call low-level perpetrators, which are soldiers on the ground, within the territorial jurisdiction of Ukraine is likely to be difficult. The reason for that is very high-level perpetrators, heads of state, heads of government, foreign ministers are not going to find themselves in Ukrainian territory. Mid-level perpetrators, commanders, etc., may be found in Ukrainian territory, but again, it's unlikely. And for very high-level perpetrators, there is an extremely difficult evidential challenge. So you've got to connect, for instance, a shooting on the ground all the way up the chain of command, and that's why the linkage evidence is often very difficult to come by. So the likelihood is that we are looking at accountability for largely low-level perpetrators that are apprehended within Ukraine, and one day, if there are mechanisms available and perpetrators are found outside of jurisdiction, they may be apprehended for the international mechanisms I've referred to. So in respect of the domestic crimes, there are various challenges of prosecution which relate to scale, expertise, timeliness, and fairness, and I'm happy to go into detail for questions. But essentially, each of these challenges can be mitigated, but they require the mobilization of very large resources, both within Ukraine and internationally. So my final point really is we should consider framing the discussion that we've had today in this ever unfolding and precarious geopolitical environment. This year there'll be some 70 elections worldwide, and that includes elections in 7 of the most populous countries. Support and funding for Ukraine's justice efforts is very likely to wane, but hopefully some of that will be mitigated from strong support in Europe. But also critically, the support of the Global South is needed for these accountability mechanisms. The armed conflict in Ukraine is likely to remain protracted and prolonged, so we have to take some salutary and salient lessons where international crimes were investigated in other situations, such as Bosnia and more recently Iraq and Syria. Just to give you an indication, we talked in the previous panel about sexual violence, which numbered possibly 50 to 60,000 in Bosnia. But 30 years after the conflict in Bosnia, only 130 successful prosecutions have ever taken place. 200 cases are still pending, and the vast majority of those perpetrators will never see a courtroom. So for these reasons, I think it's incredibly important that stakeholders in this room are in for the long haul through funding, provision of specialist expertise, ensuring that best practice is adhered to, and also ensuring that ultimately survivors and victims get the psychosocial support and legal support, not just today, but 10 years from now, because it's their testimony, their strength, and their agency that will determine ultimately whether perpetrators will be tried in courts of law and it's their interests that we must ultimately uphold and safeguard. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions which are burning in my own mind because I have that prerogative. And then I'm going to turn to the audience. We are, of course, running behind time, of course, because it's so important what we're talking about. I want to talk about, first of all, building on what everyone has talked about, is the issue of evidence and how to gather evidence in these situations. I'm very minded of the NGO Hear Their Cries. I don't know if people know about it, but they've had enormous success recently gathering DNA evidence from war, particularly from rape in conflict, where there have been children born as a result. There are other ways of gathering DNA evidence, other types of evidence, film-based evidence, documentation, etc. You talked about best practice. Where can people go? Well, how can people do this in situations in which they find themselves under huge stress, probably not really thinking at that time, you know, how to gather evidence, but what's the sort of thing that people can do in those situations that could make prosecution much more likely in the future, much more successful, and then, you know, have a feedback into a, you know, think twice at least, if not deter, would-be perpetrators of such terrible atrocities. I don't know, maybe Arif, Melinda, I'll start with you both.
I mean, we're actually in a very good position in terms of documenting conflict-related sexual violence and other crimes. There's now a vast repository of guidance and protocols and information that's available for people on the ground who document crimes such as this. Baroness Helich had referred to the International Protocol for Prosecuting and Investigating Sexual Violence, which the FCO had really pioneered, and that's an incredible document, hugely rich resource, which really breaks it down of how you do from A to Z, how you would document an international crime. There are now much more protocols. There's the Nadia Code, which has been adopted by the Ukrainian government, and various other trainings and materials that are available online. So it's, you know, those things are really, the basics are set out there. For instance, not to re-traumatize survivors, how to do interviews sensitively, how to document evidence and keep a chain of custody. And in addition to this kind of knowledge network that's out there, which is readily available online, there are now these investigative mechanisms that I've mentioned that are now available. There's a joint investigative team under Eurojust. There's an OSCE mission under the Moscow mechanism, and there's several other huge international accountability mechanisms, which are all very readily available to NGOs and other practitioners. So I think we're actually in a very advantageous position. The question is, you can document all of this, but where's it going to go, and who's going to do that really tough work of trials and apprehending perpetrators? So you need really a joined up approach between all these different bodies, and also the long-term resources available to apprehend perpetrators in the future.
But for already traumatized people, this can be further trauma. Melinda, you talked about there, you know, women are not queuing up to give this evidence, to make statements. Danielle, you probably have similar experience. I mean, how do we create a culture where people can do this in these situations and feel empowered to gather this evidence and bring it forward?
Well, I mean, as ever, right, it's a series of issues inside the country. Pre-war, when I was talking with women who had experienced domestic violence, there was a combination of, well, that's what happens in the marriage, and nothing would ever happen if I took that to any official level. And it's not that different in terms of women reporting sexual violence committed by Russian troops. So there's something there about, which is a huge challenge, I think, because the truth is we will be in this for years, and you cannot promise a woman who has been raped that she's going to get justice.
Anywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if she were, she's in a long line of thousands of people. You know, you've referred to just how many cases there are. So the triage is going to be really important. The local prosecutor generals have a really important role in their own communities in trying to personalise this a bit, this massive legal process. The other thing, Arif referred to this, but it was a huge concern in the first phase of the invasion when a lot of women were crossing the border into Poland, and NGOs were streaming in to gather that evidence, and there was no coordination of that evidence back to a central place that was causing a real problem for the Ukrainian government, but also was breeding cynicism inside Poland among refugees who were like, well, I told my story, nothing happened. And who are these people anyway who are not, they may have the handbook, all due respect, they may have the handbook, but without that specialist understanding of how you handle those issues, I'm not sure that everybody who was doing that in Poland, it was their business to do that. I understand why they were doing it, though. There was a huge rush to help and a huge horror, particularly after Bucha, to lean in and try and, you know, get as much as you could. But coordination, as boring as it sounds, it was never more important. And as you said, it continues to be a really important part of the solution.
Donia, I saw you nodding, saw you taking notes.
Yes, actually, Dame Melinda just made the exact point that I was about to make, which is the criticality of coordination on the ground. I mean, Ukraine is in the wonderful position of having so many civil society groups, NGOs, various entities, lots of volunteer agencies, but there needs to be maybe a bit more coordination so that people aren't being interviewed 2, 3, 4 times and more. One of the things that we do in terms of contributing to the collection of evidence, because we don't collect evidence, our role is preliminary fact-finding, public reporting, which we hope will lead to greater accountability efforts because we document trends and patterns. One of the things we do is in all of our interviews, we try to get informed consent by the person we're interviewing to refer the cases to the prosecutor's office. My team is across the country all day, every day during these interviews. So we try to coordinate with the right bodies. And the other point I'd like to make that was just mentioned briefly, but I think it's important to emphasize, is ensuring that there are survivor support mechanisms in place, particularly psychosocial support, so that people can safely give evidence and support these mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. Shahida, I mean, you're gathering data, you're gathering documented evidence in terms of interviews. Journalists all over are doing the same. Is this something that you think makes a contribution, at least provides some backdrop to likelihood, etc., that could be put forward to support testimonies?
Before I get to your question, we shouldn't forget about the male rape, because when we talk about, girls and women, men, from my experience working in other parts of the world, never speak about it, but later on, male rape is, I think, is on the same level as female rape, sometimes bigger. And I dread to think that in Ukrainian occupied territories, that is the case at the moment. And men are not going to come and talk about it, but some probably will. Now, coming to the issue of evidence, I would like every journalist to read the document which Arif you referred to, because what happens that people rush to interview, I'm only talking about the children. Children were coming back and they're met by hordes of journalists. They were hungry, they were tired, and all these people asking, what you were doing, how was it in the camp? And the kids I spoke to, because I came to them after 3-4 months when they're back and etc., they started calling journalists paparazzi. They hate journalists because they put the microphone in front of their face and the camera is there and the light is there, and they're absolutely terrified. This is not the way to work with people like this. You can't do this. So I think it's very important maybe to issue, we're not going to read 300 pages, but some concise version of that book, instructions of how to work with traumatized people, especially children. And their parents as well. So that would be extremely helpful.
Thank you. I'm going to, in the interest of time now, turn to the audience. I have a couple of questions online, but I'm going to go to our audience in the room first. If I could go, please, to this person here. Oh, yes, hello. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Aditi Gupta. I'm Policy Director at Protection Approaches. My question is around the use of atrocities as a strategy. So Dame Melinda Simmons, you spoke about the use of atrocities as a strategy to subjugate Ukrainians. In our work at Protection Approaches, we've also been looking at the use of atrocities to unravel the international system, kind of pull and fray at those edges. And I wanted to ask a question kind of to the panel about documenting atrocities and the targeting of LGBTQI plus communities specifically in Ukraine and Russia, because this has been seen to be part of Putin's strategy of pitting traditional family values, tapping into the global anti-gender movements against sort of gay liberal Europe. Over the last few weeks, we've even seen Russia's anti-LGBT laws come in Russia to criminalize people who have connections with this movement or this identity, and whether you're seeing similar dynamics in your work in Ukraine and documenting atrocities.
Thank you, Diti. Such an important question. I'm going to take a group of questions together in the interest of time. So who else wanted to? I saw somebody here and then someone at the front. Thank you. And if you could do the same as Diti and identify yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Tom Walling from The Independent. Thank you to everyone at the panel. I suppose this one for Danielle, but also for the panel in its entirety. Is there capacity for the UN to get involved in the rescuing of Ukrainian children? The numbers, I think there's less than 2% have been taken, according to what Ukraine have said. Is there a way that the UN could help with that mission? And to what extent, why are those numbers so low? I know a lot of it is because Russia make it impossible for people to be rescued, but is there any other reason why those numbers might be so incredibly low?
Thank you. And then the last question at the front here, please. Thank you. I hope I'll come back to you. I've got a couple online still.
Hi, I'm Emily Pry. I was on the panel before, and I had a quick question for Shahida. If I heard correctly in your remarks, you mentioned that there were volunteers in Russia also helping to return kidnapped children. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, and just are there many NGOs, CSOs, individuals on the Russian side working to help these children in coordination with Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know where to begin. Who would like to start?
I cannot comment on the first question about LGBTQ because this is not the category I work with. And I think maybe Melinda, you could, no? I'll comment on the children. Well, Russian volunteers, yes, there are not a lot, but quite a few volunteer groups in Russia. And of course, they all work secretly. And they're doing an amazing job in finding children and trying to get in touch with their Ukrainian counterparts. I know there is a group of Russian volunteers who work outside Russia doing exactly the same and coordinating and fundraising, etc. At the moment, they're trying to get people out of occupied Kakhovka from this territory to Europe. And I have to tell you that they're doing an amazing job in doing this, because to find these children is harder and harder. They used to be listed in the Usanoviti.ru, this adoption.ru site with their photos, not anymore. So it's really difficult. So it's really finding something in the sand. But they're doing a good job.
Thank you. Melinda.
Well, not a lot to add, actually, including on LGBTQ. I can't comment on what's going on in Russia. I'm not a Russia specialist. Inside Ukraine, pre-war, one of the most amazing things actually was how Pride in particular was driving a much greater and more mainstream understanding of, acceptance of, in some cases even enthusiasm. I remember being on a Pride march just after COVID and before the war, where I saw these elderly women come out of a building with mops, which I honestly thought they were going to throw at us. And instead they were waving them as a kind of hello. It was extraordinary, because it wasn't too many years. It was only about 2 or 3 years before where there had been violence. In fact, the previous year, Pride in Odessa had seen violence. So seeing Ukrainians come out, Kyivites come out on the street and wave as you were, doing your Pride march was an amazing thing. And it was also in that time that updated legislation on homophobia was passed in the Rada. That too was incredibly important, so including anti-Semitism actually. So there was a raft of rights-related legislation that was going through the Rada that was so many years overdue, but it was happening at that time, so that was fantastic. As for the invasion, it became quite hard actually to delineate how different groups, if you like, were experiencing things. But I will tell you a tiny little story, which is that when I was visiting troops as part of the president's team, so I was traveling with a few other ambassadors, and one of the things that soldiers would often do is take the chevron off their uniform and hand it to you as a thank you. On one particular trip, I was given two, which I cherish. And one was from women soldiers who had their own chevron with a sign for women fighters, and the other was from a trooper who was gay and gave me his chevron. There is a chevron that exists in the Ukrainian army that denotes you as a sort of proud LGBTQ. And I absolutely love both those chevrons and kept them on the wall at the embassy for a really long time before bringing them home. But really, you can't underestimate the importance of a trooper in a patriarchal society feeling okay about fighting on the front line, wearing a chevron that denotes him as being part of the LGBTQ community. Thanks.
Thank you. Danielle, is this something that you can address, that you're covering?
Yes, if I could just make two quick points. First, regarding the question on UN support to return children to Ukraine. Indeed, there is the need for greater efforts and support from the international community to return these children. And then there was a sub-question that asked about underreporting of these numbers. From our side, we've documented over 200 children who were forcibly transferred or deported to the occupied territory by the Russian territory in 8 separate cases. And what we documented was entirely in line with what Shahida had discussed during her remarks. Our numbers are much lower because they only include the children that we've actually interviewed in the cases that we've actively documented. Of course, the actual number is much, much higher. On LGBT, we haven't documented a lot of cases for the reasons that have been set out in terms of stigma, but one of the main reasons is we don't have access to occupied territory. So it's very difficult for us to speak face-to-face with people who have, from the LGBT community. However, what we expect or what we are concerned about is the broader environment inside the occupied territory, which actively restricts free speech, free expression. And so, for example, what we've seen in open source is reporting that Russia has outlawed international LGBT movements and considered it as extremist. But I mean, that's open source reporting. So we are very much underreporting on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So online, I've got a question and a couple of comments. One comment is from Hanan Reyes, who says, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. This was one of the main points cemented in the UN document, the Istanbul Protocol on the documentation of torture, including sexual torture. Testimonies about sexual torture and violence will almost always be confused, dates mixed up, places forgotten, etc. This is normal for a victim of torture who is severely traumatized by the experience. And I think it's important to note that. Thank you, Hanan. Then we have a question from Anthony Pafiti, perhaps Pafiti. In exercising universal jurisdiction, is it actually appropriate for states to try those accused in their domestic courts when they will apply domestic law? And there is no actual requirement to, this is for you, clearly, Arif. There is no actual requirement to apply or recognize international defenses available to the accused, such as the combatant's defense, command responsibility, superior orders, lawful commands, etc., civilians identified as combatants, and so on. He refers to the Shishi Marine case as one that raises many such fair trial concerns. Maybe I can get you to answer that last one, Arif, and then I can go on to the last one online.
Sure. I mean, universal jurisdiction, it's not a panacea, so it really depends in the jurisdiction that you're talking about. Of the 20 countries that have activated universal jurisdiction, the vast majority are applying, they're applying domestic law, but actually they are interpreting international criminal law, which has been incorporated into their domestic system. And so they are really applying the same criteria that I've talked about, particularly if they're members of the International Criminal Court. The real challenge here is that there are various procedural hurdles. What if the perpetrator is not there and you're having a trial in absentia? Is that going to be fair? What about veto powers on the prosecution service? What about immunities? So for instance, head of states, head of governments, foreign ministers can't be tried in foreign domestic courts. Some courts have problems with what are called functional immunities if you're a state official being tried in a foreign court. So there are lots of technical legal hurdles to universal jurisdiction, which is why often the International Criminal Court is seized of jurisdiction. I did think in the first two questions, if I may very briefly make two remarks, there was a question about motivation, which I think Dame Melinda had also raised. So motivation is not often a relevant criteria for international crimes, but motivation, plans and policies can be indicative of intent. So for instance, when it comes to the transfer of children, you depending on what the intent there is, you can be in the category of one very serious crime, which is genocide. So one of the elements, so genocide is the commission of one or more of 5 prohibited acts with a specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, religious or ethnic group. So if there is evidence to suggest that Russia is transferring these children in order to change their identity from Ukrainian into Russian, or they are doing it in order to limit the biological reproduction of the Ukrainian population, then you suddenly are in very serious territory of the crime of genocide. And so that's why documenting intent is very difficult, but if the circumstances allow it, it can be really critical for categorizing the crime.
Thank you. And a final point from Rachel Friesek, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Rachel, who talked about a meeting of the OSCE Warsaw Human Dimension Conference in October 2023 at a side event in which one of the lead prosecutors of sex assault cases from Ukraine said he didn't have the necessary training for his office to prosecute cases, and the work around collecting evidence needed support. She had asked about rape kits and the training needed, and had asked that before, and yet the training still wasn't made available. So she's really saying, you know, what can be done on the local level to provide this training and provide these kits that could make such a difference? I think I'm just going to leave that question there, because I think it's a question that we would all have various suggestions for, but I think it's a really important question to raise. I'm going to turn now to the last round in the room. Please, at the back. Thank you. There's 2 people there. Thanks. I'm sorry, I'm going a bit late, quite unilaterally.
Thank you very much. William Horsley, University of Sheffield, Journalism and Media. Question to Arif or anybody about the Global South. Why is it crucial to get the Global South on board with some of this? And do you see any chance of removing the entrenched position of many in the Global South, whether it's from expediency or genuine resentment from the colonial past? And if I may, what culpability might there be for Russian journalists perpetrating the falsehoods and inciting violence in Ukraine?
Thank you.
Ukrainian Institute, London. I wanted to ask about the role of the Red Cross. What access the Red Cross has been given to Ukrainian prisoners in Russia and vice versa, and what, if anything, they've done to help reduce violence against Ukrainian prisoners in Russia. Second question, just point of fact, I'm interested in what percentage of abducted children came from orphanages?
Thank you. And the last question from Mary at the back, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Tashevsky, I'm a journalist. A question for Arif, which is about abduction of children. If I were Russian, which I hasten to say I'm not, I would argue that there are quite strict laws regulating what you're supposed to do as an occupying power. And that might include safeguarding children. And I might call what has happened evacuation rather than abduction. Would I have a case? And a question for Dame Melinda, which is, I think in the first summer of the war, there was a very, very strange case when I think the chairwoman of the Parliamentary Human Rights Commission was sacked, apparently by Zelensky, for going around the world and, as it was said, exaggerating the extent of sexual violence, particularly rape, against Ukrainian women. And that version did not come from any Russian sources. It was what was being said inside Ukraine. Did it have any sort of negative effect on the campaign against sexual violence inside Ukraine?
Thank you. And turning back to the panel, I have one question that I thought it would come up, but it's the role of disinformation in all of this, and how we cope with disinformation. And I think it connects to the Global South issue as well, as to the information that's put out from the region. So much of it is being put out by Russia, particularly to many other countries around the world. And how do we deal with that in trying to get to the truth of the issue? So I'm actually going to go in reverse order from the original panel. So I'm going to turn Arif to you first.
Thank you. I'll take the question on the Global South first. I think the difficulty here is that we are talking about broad principles, rule of law, international human rights law, international criminal law. And often, if you are talking to stakeholders in other states, particularly outside of Europe or North America, the immediate retort often is, why should we care about the Ukrainians when you don't care about X, Y, or Z conflict? Why should we challenge the prohibition on aggression when the UK had found itself in Iraq and the US found itself in Iraq, which may well have violated the provisions on the prohibition of use of force? So I think Iraq is a little bit distant. You can make the argument, I would say quite forcefully, that look, one wrong in Iraq or elsewhere shouldn't mean that the Ukrainians suffer from essentially enforcing what is binding international law. But of course that becomes really difficult if at the same time you're saying we've got to challenge impunity and have accountability and justice in Ukraine. You cannot say that with other situations where they are in the Global South, whether that's Sudan, Ethiopia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and obviously in the conflict which is very much in our minds in Israel and Palestine. And so that's something that we have to grapple with. We have to acknowledge inconsistency. We have to be consistent in applying the rule of law, even if that's against our own cause, so to speak. And that is a real problem for getting support in the UN General Assembly, which is really the only consensual body that can act in many of these instances because the UN Security Council is paralyzed. So that's really the reason I'd say that it's critical for Global South support, particularly in this year where you're going to see huge turbulence. There was a question, I think, on the abduction of children. So the Russians' case is, well, you know, these children, we've taken over this territory which has decided to become Russian, and, you know, these children were at risk, so we've taken them into safety in Russia, and of course they're entitled to leave whenever they want. But of course, none of that is true. There is no evidence to suggest that this is voluntary. There are no schemes or structures in place in order to allow repatriation. There is no suggestion that there is external monitoring of the children who are there and how they are being treated. So really, the evidence just points one way on all of this, is that these children were forcibly transferred. The International Criminal Court has a reasonable belief standard, which it has met, and the judges have approved that there is possibility of the war crime of unlawful deportation and transfer. So it's really for the Russian state to now come back and present evidence that this is not the case and immediately repatriate all of these children. And then just two short points. One was this suggestion of figures. There's this figure of 2%. only 2% of children have been taken, so, you know, what's the problem? But of course, 2% of what? Is it 2% of the territory that Russia has occupied? Is it 50% of a particular town? Is it 100% of a village? You know, we've got to look and dig down, because of course, if you extrapolate from, let's say, 50% of an entire town, if Russia was to take the entirety of Ukraine, what would that mean for all the children? What would it mean for the men who are often tortured, if not executed? What would be the biological and physical impact on Ukrainian population? So we've really got to be careful with the numbers, I think, and we've got to look at the pattern rather than the abstract numbers.
Sorry, can I just interject? I meant to say 2% of the children that Ukraine have said have been taken have been rescued. It's about, as you said, 388.
Yeah. That was the 2%. Okay.
The numbers are 2%.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. I should also say that I've heard a number of people from various countries in the former USSR refer to Russia as a colonial power. Just to say that, it's an interesting point that they make. I'm now going to turn to Shahida for comments and closing out. You don't have to answer every question, just we are very, very late now.
There was a question about Red Cross. Because they don't speak to journalists, we can never know to what extent they're involved, but I'm talking about the children in particular. They're involved in certain extent, but to a very limited one. I know the cases when the children were moved from Russia to Belarus, and Red Cross played a role just bringing them from Russia to Minsk and then handing them over to the Ukrainian parents or whatever legal guardians. Other than that, I don't think they are doing much, but I know that Belarusian Red Cross is participating in this cases when Ukrainian children are moved to Belarus for summer camp or some sort of relaxation camp, and Belarusian Red Cross was actively participating in that. And I think the International Red Cross is into that case. I have to say, yeah, hundreds of Ukrainian children are in Belarus for relaxation period where they're actually indoctrinated. About the orphanages and the percentage of, it's very difficult to say what's the percentage of this 20,000 or whatever thousand, because I'm not sure about the figure, to be honest. I would say maybe 30%. And these are the children who are very difficult to bring back, because Maria Lvova-Belova said it very straight. Those who have parents, legal guardians, will go back if they come. Orphans, no. And with many orphans, you do not have legal guardians of anyone to come back. She was also very specific. There should be father, mother, grandmother, no aunts, uncles, whatever. So we have a problem, not even cousins. And they need to do DNA test to prove that they are related. So unfortunately, and I'm dealing with one of these orphans at the moment, and hopefully we're going to get him back to Ukraine. It's extremely hard, especially with boys. They don't like to give away boys age 16, 17, because I think these orphans potentially can feel and go and fight.
Thank you. Melinda?
So I guess just a couple of points on the Global South. Ukraine needs Global South support in the international community on every level, in the OSCE and in the European Council, and they need them in the UN to be backing their fight and to be calling out these issues and the range of issues. And the last public polling that I saw suggested that support for Ukrainian Global South countries was beginning to dip. And, you know, there are all kinds of reasons why you might think why, but the central challenge for Ukraine is that actually the best advocates in those countries are Ukrainians themselves. And the Foreign Minister, Kuleba, has done, I think, the most fantastic job, literally, you know, making his way around these countries with his deputies, making the case and pulling, if you like, support back behind him. But just one visit doesn't do it. And Ukraine's diplomatic network globally is not comprehensive, which really hamstrings their efforts to be able to keep that support to a sustained level. So it's a challenge. It's going to be it's continuing to be a challenge, and one I think you can see that Zelensky is seized of, because Zelensky himself is having calls with heads of state and government from those countries, because he's very alive to the need of that support just for me to finish on the role of disinformation, you're right, and actually I did have it in my notes on hybrid war and then didn't mention it and should have, because it is as much part of the plan that, as everything else. The answer to that is part of what I suggested at the top, which is that we have to keep doing these and we have to keep telling things like they are. Because if we don't tell things like they are, that is not a vacuum that you can just leave there. It gets filled by the likes of Maria Lvova-Belova, who's saying, no, there aren't that many children, or no, there aren't parents. And it fills that space and it owns that space, and it's something that Russians and their trolls are incredibly good at doing, and that, frankly, we're less good at doing. We do some fantastic campaign and then we move on, can't actually move on to the other issue. We have to keep talking about it.
Well, they do say that, you know, a lie is halfway around the world when truth is still doing up its shoelaces. So I think this is a problem. Danielle, you've got the last 2 minutes max, and we have to end.
Role of disinformation or countering disinformation, documentation is, and accurate monitoring is absolutely key. We'll continue to do so. I'll quickly respond to the question that was asked about training and rape kits for CRSV. First, Ukraine, from what we've seen, is setting an example of global best practice in terms of the way that they're responding to survivors of CRSV, both in terms of pursuing accountability as well as supporting efforts for survivors. There's a framework of cooperation in place between the United Nations and the Ukrainian government on addressing CRSV, and there's many international actors involved in this mechanism. For example, UNFPA is providing rape kits. And so thus efforts are ongoing, taking into account the needs that have been expressed by government and survivors. So thank you again for letting me be part of this panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being so succinct at the end as well. This is such an important topic. I'm glad we had a few minutes to run over, and I'd like to thank everyone's patience. I want to thank, first of all, New Lines Institute, of course, for our collaboration, our Russia-Eurasia programme at Chatham House, who've done an extraordinary job, my colleagues here, our speakers, of course, who've really given us not only their time, but their enormous expertise and commitments, and I really want to thank you for that. And then to finally thank, of course, you in the audience, and including online, for your engagement, your questions, and for sitting through and listening. I hope you take this away, and I hope everyone finds a way to act on it. I think that's really the most important thing that we can do right now in each of our own individual capabilities. Even if it's donating money, do that as well, whatever else you do. Thank you.